All right, well, it is 4 o'clock, and to be respectful of your time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I can see we have a really small group, um, which is good, though. I think we can have a really good conversation. Um, my name is Angie McKinney, and I'm one of the technical assistant specialists with the IEP Technical Assistance Center. You'll notice that Marcy Wilburn's name is also on here. She's our associate director. And in the series of covering all the high leverage practices, there's sometimes that Marcy's going to present these, sometimes that I will, and sometimes that we'll probably be on there together, just depending on schedules. So you'll have her contact information at the end of the PowerPoint as well. I will show you here in just a minute where to get your hands on the handout in case you like to have things printed. I'm a printed kind of person, so I totally understand that. So for tonight, we are going to really be focused on the high leverage practices that are connected with assessment. I want to start off, though, by finding out who's here. So let me bump to my next screen. If you could put in the chat, I can see your names already, but just share the district that you work for, the role that you're in, and then either a yes or a no as to whether you attended the first session, since I wasn't at the first session. I love it when we get people all over the state too. I mean, when we do things remotely, we see people coming in from all the corners of the state. So Megan, you were not at the first one, so I'll just kind of give you a background of what exactly these are. Warwani, okay. Bloomington. Katie, you're funny. That cover everybody already? Okay, I'll keep my eye on that in case we have any other additions to that. So for those of you who weren't at the first session, there are a set of very specific practices that tend to have big payoff for students with disabilities. And these were constructed in kind of a partnership between the Council for Exceptional Children and the Cedar Center. And they put together these different high leverage practices to say, hey, let us tell you what works. Now, for those of you who are in the world of special education, you know these things work, right? These are things that we do naturally. These are things, quite honestly, that all teachers do. Special ed, general ed, it doesn't really matter. We have really good practices happening, but sometimes not necessarily with the frequency and purposeful use that would really make them effective. So even though we know, like every practice that we're going to talk about, you're going to say, of course, yes, we do that. But it's making sure that your colleagues and your team that come together to work to support students with disabilities know that we have to do things and be thinking about that we're always doing these things. That's what makes a difference when using high leverage practices. Now, these were designed for students with disability, or not designed for them, but they were kind of identified as practices that are really helpful for students with disabilities, but they work for all students. Like everything that you see, you're going to be thinking in your head, yeah, all students would benefit from that. We just know that sometimes it takes more deliberate purpose when we are teaching students with disabilities. So in the first session, and if you would like to be able to see that first session and you missed it, send me an email after we get this done, and I will make sure tomorrow to get you the recording of that first session. So here's what I'm hoping for in our time this evening. It's a fairly short amount of time, but we're going to be looking over those assessment related high leverage practices. And so what I am wanting you to be able to get from this is to see how you're using data, and specifically lots of different kinds of data within your current practices now, to really get a good understanding of what do we mean by data literacy and how important is that. We're going to talk about the risk framework, which is used when we're talking about data and sharing information. We'll talk a little bit about the use of formative and summative assessment, and then we'll also dig just a little bit into a concept called data-based individualization. And I will show you where you can learn more about that, because we definitely don't have time to teach the whole process and teach it well, but I can connect you with places that can train on it much better than I can for free. So yes, Megan, and my email will be at the end of the presentation, but it's angela.mckinney@indstate.edu. And I'll have Katie type that in the chat. All right, so here is the link that you can go to. You can either scan the QR code or go to the actual typed in link. But this is the link to be able to get to the Padlet. And the Padlet has a handout for tonight. It has a handout from the last session. And I put a few resources that I think you might need related to assessment in the assessment column. And every time we do another session, we'll be adding on to the information that is in there. So I'll leave this up for just a second to make sure everybody can get to that, because again, this is where you can find a copy of the PowerPoint and be able to just download that. But you might want to bookmark this particular Padlet link, because we will keep adding to it over time, and you'll see a variety of new resources on the Padlet. So when we think about assessment, we know that special education teachers and other special ed educators, because we know we have speech pathologists, we have school psychologists. Katie and I are both school psychologists. We have lots of people who are in the world of special education. And we know that students that have disabilities are not simple. They have complex needs, and they also have strengths, right? Every single one of our students, I don't care what the disability, I don't care how severe the disability, every single one of our students also has strengths that are mixed in with those areas that we need to support. And so anyone who is effective in our field are people who really have a good understanding of those strengths and needs and can put that whole picture together. Now, within assessment, there are 3 different high leverage practices. And I will show you this at the end. There's a link to this on the Padlet, and there is also a slide, I think, that shows this resource. But there is a whole set, sorry for a second here, of high leverage practice. This does not work well with my background screen. Okay, that's not, you can't see any of that. There are these laminated guides that are fantastic. I can almost get one in there. There you go. And there is one on each of the areas of high leverage practices. And these come with, they come with a cost, right? So they are not cheap to buy, but they kind of take everything about high leverage practices and boil it down to some really key tips. So before we end today, I'm actually going to pick two of you at random, and we're going to send you a set of the high leverage practice guides just so that you can have. We actually had a winner at the first session, and that person already had access to the guides. So she was happy to give those back and hand them off to someone else. So we're going to give away two tonight. But they're really fantastic. There are a lot of different books that are resources out there too, but I feel like the books are a lot more complex. This is almost like the simple guide that you need to be able to understand and use the high leverage practices. So we are going to start with high leverage practice 4. And that is using multiple sources of information to be able to get the big picture of what's going on with the student. So I think when we look at any student, we know that one source, one test, one assessment, even sometimes one evaluation only gives us part of the whole picture. And so we can't take a student's iLearn scores and know everything about them. We're pulling from lots of different kinds of sources of information in order to understand exactly what those needs are and to be able to have enough of a sense of their strengths to figure out how do we build on that. So I am actually going to skip this because this is not correct. I discovered this today when I was looking at information. So you will find this in your slide. This is actually pulling from some information related to collaboration. So I sent a note off to the High Leverage Practices website to say, hey, there's somebody copy pasted wrong on this. So I want you to see that it was in the PowerPoint that was uploaded, but this is not quite correct. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about exactly what is in the High Leverage Practices guide. But first, what I want you to do, and you know what, I think we're gonna do this in the chat instead of through the Menti because we do have such a small amount of people. So I want you to go to the chat. And I want you to look at the picture first. And probably all of you have seen this little comic before. I feel like sometimes when we're talking about students with disabilities, they are the elephant that's been asked to climb the tree, right? The assessments that we use to figure out whether that student is successful or not is not always fair. So I want you to put in the chat the kinds of assessments that you're already using so that we can pull together that information. So where do you get your data from? And any kind of examples. We've got some standardized testing, we've got statewide testing, we've got some national kinds of assessments and benchmarking. Grades, tests, homework, attendance, beautiful, right? We know a lot about a student sometimes from their attendance. Common assessments, exit slips. Keep digging. Student interviews, yes. Go directly to the source sometimes. Ask kids what they know, especially for the kids who aren't good test takers. Okay, keep adding to those if you think of any more, but there are a lot of different ways that we can pull together information. Using rubrics, yes, to be able to really identify both the positives and the challenging areas for students. So within the high leverage practice, the laminated guide for each of the high leverage practices, it pulls together some things that people ought to think about. And so one of the things that is within the assessment guide for high leverage practice 4 is they really talk about that we need to be thinking about some of the times that we really use that data, right? And so when we pull together data, it's not just about creating those progress reports or determining eligibility. We know those times are important, right? But sometimes we need new data when we're discussing placement, right? For a student who we maybe need to change their placement, when we need to determine what kind of supports happen, or which things are most appropriate for a student, making changes, adding accommodations and modifications, writing those goals, right? We have to have really good information to write a really good goal. Otherwise, it may be a really good goal that's not so applicable for that student. And then also sometimes we will pull together lots of sources of information in those critical moments, like when there's a family crisis, when something is going on with the student and we need to tap into that whole picture of the child in order to know how to best support them. So there's within the guide, there's times when you might use those different kinds of sources of information. And then there are also some questions that might be helpful in developing that whole comprehensive understanding. So, we may look at, are we really focused on all the pieces and parts of an assessment or just the overall score, right? If you look at a student's, for example, their IQ score, that's one piece. But within any student and their IQ score, they've got highs and lows and strengths and weaknesses and things that sometimes are off the charts in a good way, but we don't see that from the overall score. So it's really important that we're using all of those different pieces. Are we getting input from the parents? Right? Are we pulling together that information as well and really talking about what do they want for their child and what do they see at home and how is that different? And then are we also thinking about the cultural background of the student and bringing that to the table as well? Because that can make a difference on how we interpret some of the information. So all of those things are really important. But we know that the bottom line is we have to use those multiple sources of information. If we don't, I mean, you probably heard of the term triangulating data, right? That means that we are taking, at least 3 different kinds of information in order to say, yes, we're confident in what that data is showing us. And so a lot of the things that you talked about, we may have grades, we may have exit slips, and we may have KTEA information. And when it lines up, we feel super confident about that information. When it doesn't line up, it kind of causes us to look beyond that and think, okay, what does this mean? Why are we getting different scores? Why are we seeing differences in the student? Because that can really affect how we then support them when we start figuring out some of those things. All right. The second high leverage practice is interpreting and communicating that assessment information with everybody involved so that we can come together and figure out what to do, right? We can design those programs and be able to implement them. So lots of different things related to this, but I want to start with thinking about stakeholders. So again, I'm going to skip the Menti part of this and we'll just do this in the chat. But who are we talking about when it comes to stakeholders? Students, parents, staff, teachers, both special ed and gen ed teachers, related arts teachers. Social workers. What is an FCM, Ellen?
That's the family case manager for a family that might be going through like a reunification process with DCS.
Thank you. Pastors, right? Sometimes we do have pastors that are involved in, I mean, as a parent, you can bring anybody, right? And you may have a pastor that is part of that team. I'm feeling a little left out here, though, as a school psychologist. Your school psychs, your OTs, your PTs, right? We sometimes have students that have complicated teams. And I feel like I'm a pretty good data person, right? I know how to explain data pretty well, right? Until all of a sudden I'm reading the speech pathologist report and thinking, I'm not sure what that test does. I'm not sure what that means. Sometimes it gets a little confusing when it's out of your discipline. So I think, even people who feel like they're really strong in something, I'm really strong in the data related to the stuff I know, maybe not so much in the areas that I don't know. And so it really does take a team to be able to pull all of this together and kind of break it down. And really understand what all of those different areas are talking about. So we know who we're sharing information with and who are those stakeholders. But what about the frequency? So how often should we be sharing that assessment data? I'll give you a hint. There's really not a correct answer here. Good question. Okay. Sometimes quarterly, sometimes weekly. You guys are right on it here. It depends on the kid. It depends on the situation. The more frequently that we look at the information, the better understanding I think that we have. We know what the law says about sharing progress monitoring information, right? In a formal way. So we know that when we give out report cards, we are giving the information on progress on goals, right? That's that IEP requirement. But beyond that, we have other data that comes in, and we do have some parents, for example, that we might be sharing daily behavior data with. We have some teachers that we're checking in and we're sharing bits of information back and forth, maybe on a weekly basis and during some planning time that we all have, right? Lots of planning time. It really does depend on a variety of factors. But I think the more often that we share that information, the more frequently we can try to figure out, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for changes that we might make for the student and for kind of their planning? Now, within high leverage practice, number 5, it also talks about the risk framework. And I really like this. And especially, again, coming from a school psychology background, I like the way that the risk framework is kind of laid out. So this stands for review, interpret, streamline, and communicate. And I'll go over each of these and kind of explain what they mean within the framework. So when we're talking about reviewing information, they ask you, well, is the information that we're sharing, whether it's coming from a report or a progress monitoring note or anything that we're sharing out, is it clear and understandable for the people who are the intended audience, right? Does it make sense? I know I've written some reports in the past that I look back and read now and think, holy cow, that is so full of jargon and terms that were, super high level vocabulary that nobody cared about but me at the time. And they're really hard to understand. So I tend to write my reports now in much more simple terms. So hang on to that question, and I will jump back to that. So with special educators, we should make sure that we're looking at all of the different assessment data that we have, especially those that are being presented to parents or going out to some of our colleagues who maybe don't have as much access to the same data sources that we do. And we need to look at, are there things that need to be clearly defined? Are there things that don't make sense that we want to boil it down? So that's what the R is in the risk format or the risk framework. With interpret, is there something that needs to be broken down in a more visual way in order to be understandable, right? So we could take 30 different data points for someone and we could put them in a nice little bar graph or some sort of chart that would explain it a lot better. Is there a different way to be able to represent that to actually make sense of it? And I'll show you some examples of that here in just a minute. The S is for streamline. Can we whittle it down, right? If you've ever been in a meeting where, and I'm going to keep picking on school psychologists, but if you've ever been in a meeting where a school psychologist has basically read their report from start to finish, and you think, oh my gosh, please just give me the bullet points. Like, that's what your audience tends to want when you're talking about data. So, your parents and your fellow teachers don't want a 10-page report on all of the information, but they want the summary points in order to really know what to do and how to make sense of that. And then the last letter for C is communicate. So it is RISC. When we're using the data, how can we tell the story of the student? How can we take the information and communicate it in a way that is understandable and describes the student and that everyone can kind of use the information to participate together to figure out what to do next? So, I mean, it's a pretty simple framework, but I think just keeping these things in mind as we send out information related to assessment is really important. So I'm gonna look back here to this. Really, I think what we're talking about here, Ellen, is just making sense of. When we say interpret the data, we know we collect data all day, every day. My gosh, we collect more data in schools than anywhere else that I know of. And sometimes we collect it and we add it to the pile and add it to the pile, but we have to stop and interpret it. So again, I'm not talking about like running it through a program and analyzing it. We're talking about, let's look at it and say, what does this mean? What patterns do we see? What does this mean for the overall picture of the student? And what does it mean for instruction and support? And I think that's really what it comes down to. You know, when you have an evaluation done on a student, the evaluation is usually partly about eligibility, right? Are we eligible for this related service? Are we eligible under special ed, under a different category, any of that kind of stuff? And that's all fine and dandy. But the most useful part is, now what do we do? And so when we can take data and try to think about, what do we do with this data instructionally in order to support the student, that's the real meaningful part of data in my mind. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, so I want to show you a couple of examples, and these aren't too far out of the realm of possibility. I see stuff like this all the time. Sally had a score of 21 in September, and by January improved her score to 45. Now, if we look at the risk framework, what's wrong with this picture? Can you interpret this? Like, what does it mean? And you're welcome to unmute yourself as we talk about these things too. Like, what don't you know here? Is it the same test? That would be important, right? What is being assessed? Is 21 to 45 a big improvement? Maybe, maybe not.
Were there any accommodations given in September that were different in January?
Ooh, were the conditions different? That's a good question. So if I show you, and this is a little blurry, but that this is from some Dibbles information, right? And this is the first sound fluency. She went from a 21 to a 45. Did she make improvement? Score went up.
I would be
I can't act-
curious.
Sorry. I
I'm
can't see
so-
that so small, but what I would say is, I know with like the Dibbles, like when we did those, just because the score goes up, if you're testing like at certain periods, the goal goes up. So you have to look, what range are they in, not the actual number.
Likewise, I'd want to compare it to the percentile of, right, typically developing kids. Just like Twyla said about the goalpost is changing. I'd want to see how much progress we should expect within the year.
So you can, here is, can you see my arrow on the screen? Right here. Katie, give me a head nod. Okay, so here she's at 21 and she's just a little bit below the actual goal line. And here she's at 45, but she's further from the changed goal line than she was. So yes, she's making progress, but boy, she's not closing the gap. She's actually getting further behind. But if you look at this, this is so much more informative to a parent. It's a tool for you to be able to take a visual and explain it to the parent, and sometimes even to go over it with the teacher. You know, when we sit in meetings all the time on students and we talk about, you know, we started here and we ended here, but is that good or bad? Is that enough? We're always looking to close the gap for students, and just a number increasing doesn't necessarily mean that's happening. So you guys are making really good points. All right, here's another example. Oh, I hate this one. Jose has a RIT score of 207. I don't even know what a RIT score stands for. I mean, I know how to deal with RIT scores, and I always look at the charts, but I don't even know what RIT is an acronym for when it comes to RIT scores. And I bet some of you do because you're in that world. But so what is a 207? We don't know. But if we look at the printout from NWEA, from their MAP scores, we'll know how that compares, right? So if here, the student is at a 207, but the district average is 203, and the norm for the grade level is 209, we'd be celebrating at this case conference, right? If that was the data that we were looking for, or meeting with a parent or anything else. So this provides an easier way to make that comparison. Nancy is approaching proficiency. What don't you know here? Proficiency at what, right?
We don't know anything.
No. All we know is she's approaching proficiency. But you know, we sometimes hear statements like that. Oh, it's okay, your daughter's approaching proficiency. You know, we're almost there. Even approaching proficiency is kind of a term that you don't really hear anywhere else other than in education. And quite honestly, only on certain kinds of tests. So when we look at a student's, here's just an example of a iLearn printout for a student, we kind of have a better sense of what are we talking about here. You know, what does this compare to for other students? Where are the expectations? Is approaching proficiency like, you know, like I'm approaching Walmart, well, I'm 5 miles away, I'm approaching, or does that mean I'm pulling into the parking lot? You know, we have a lot of different ways that we can kind of look at that, but this helps a little bit more to share that information. I sometimes see things like this. You know, we mean well when we do things like this. From 10:05 to 10:35, Billy misbehaved at a rate of 0.4 times per minute. If I'm a parent and I'm seeing 0.4 times per minute, I'm thinking, did he not do like the act completely? Did he only halfway misbehave? What does that actually mean? But being able to explain to a parent, hey, I was just taking instances of things that happen and recording them. And then I divided that out per minute. So there were no half misbehaviors or whatever. And even with that, I mean, when we're talking about misbehavior, what does that mean? Because that's going to be different depending on who's observing. We know that we need to make sure and identify things a lot more clearly.
Was it all the same misbehavior?
Exactly. And how important is that, right? You know, a student who, well, I bit someone and then I spit on the floor and then I called out and then I got out of my seat. You know, if all of those things are not equal, right? So making sure that we're looking for patterns, making sure that we're clear, because even, again, sometimes when we say misbehavior in my class could be that you said no to me. Misbehavior for someone else could be that you had to turn the desk over, you know? So getting that clear definition of what we're talking about is important. And you know, parents will come to your meetings with them and they'll say, what do you mean? Tell me what you mean. Give me some examples. Having those things prepared ahead of time are going to be your friend, because you're going to have very clear data to fall back on. And again, all of our data then guides us to, okay, now what do we do? So if you have a student that exhibited, you know, 10 different behaviors, we've kind of got our hands full with trying to figure out what to do. But when we start to see a pattern and we start to look at additional data, that's where we know what to do next. Here's the last example for you. So Peter recognizes that he has difficulty controlling his emotions. How do you see that, right? How did you figure this one out? Well, you can show some examples, right? So if we use some sort of a rating with the student, this is going to show exactly what we're talking about. You know, he is able to figure some of this stuff out on his own. So again, within the resource guide, it does kind of guide you through these different things so that that you have a better understanding of what it's talking about. But we need to think about now, as we move from just that understanding that we need to have multiple kinds of assessments. You know, we need to pull that together. And then we also need to make sure that we can take the data that we have, we can communicate that and have it be specific so that we understand what that data actually means. Then that last piece of it with the higher leverage practices is using the assessment data to be able to figure out what to do, right? So again, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road as far as using the data. How do we figure out our instructional practices? How do we change things in order to improve student outcomes? So this one is actually correct. This comes from just some information that's connected with the guide. So we have our goals, right? We spend a lot of time in our meetings coming up with what's a good goal, what is an appropriate service, where are we going to do all these things? What are the accommodations and modifications that we might need? I mean, we do a lot of planning. An IEP is no small task. When we write an IEP, we are doing our best to create a roadmap for how do we get a student from where they are now to a better place, wherever that place may be. You know, we're always just looking for improvement in some area for a student. So when we use that data, we've got to really dig into the present levels of performance. That's where it all starts, right? Every time that we have an IEP meeting, because that guides everything else that we do. When we have good information about present levels and all of the information that we need about what does a student's disability look like, that's when we can set those appropriate ambitious goals for them. Not unreasonable goals, not pie in the sky kind of goals, but ambitious enough to take them further and make enough of a change that when we see it happen, we can celebrate it, right? It has to be a change that is actually meaningful for the student. And sometimes meaningful is a teeny change. And sometimes it takes bigger amounts of progress for that to really feel like it's meaningful. It's all relative to the student. We also need to make sure that we're using the information that we have to figure out that what do we do? So, you know, they talk about selecting the right kind of interventions. I don't mean this in the sense of interventions like within your RTI or your MTSS kind of process. We're talking about the instructional interventions that we're using, the methods we're using, the specially designed instruction, you know, all of the good stuff that we have, we try to align those things with what we know about the student. And the data that the student has kind of creates that picture that we say, you know what, I don't think this is going to work for the student, but based on what I'm seeing, I think we can use something different. Or we need something stronger, or we need something that is more appropriately aligned with this student's needs. We're using that progress monitoring along the way. And this is sometimes a hard concept for those of us in special ed to explain to our parents and to our other team members that are working towards the student's overall goal. That grades don't tell us a whole lot. They tell us something, but they don't tell us a whole lot about a student's progress toward their goals and towards the things that we really are emphasizing for that student. And if we waited until the end of a school year or the end of an IEP cycle, you know, wherever that falls throughout the year, and we reflect back and say, hey, that didn't work, that's a whole year basically of lost time for us to be able to move the student along. So explaining that it's not about looking at the grades. It's about me looking specifically at, are we getting there for the goals? And we're pulling together that information all the time. We don't wait until the end of a 9-week period and say, okay, let's collect a data point and report on it. We tend to be collecting data all along the way and then sharing that out at that 9-week mark, because we have to make all those little adjustments. And good teachers already do this. Remember, these are all things that I know everybody is doing, but we know that we have to do it even more frequently when it comes to students with disabilities. We're collecting data and we're shifting and we're shifting and we're shifting because we don't have time to waste. We don't have the opportunity to say, okay, that didn't work. I don't know what to do next because this is what you get, right? That's not the way anything works in education. If it didn't work, we shift. We try something else, we shift, and we're using that data to make those decisions. We need to make sure that we're using things in a format that is helpful, so that we can clearly see it, right? So if you go back to some of those examples, being able to see whether or not progress is happening can't just be that one data point. We need to see the ups and downs. The ups and downs sometimes tell us a lot too. Tell us about what some of the students' other needs might be related to supporting behavior, or for some of our kids, it's giving feedback to parents that, you know, hey, that last hour in the day is really tough. Because sometimes they go back and share that information with their pediatrician or somebody like that who may have an influence on things that we don't really have control of, like medication. And then that last piece is that as good special educators, we are patient, right? And we are persistent in trying to figure out what's working and what isn't, right? We're always analyzing things. Every day, every interaction, we're doing some kind of analyzing of what's going on and how can we make this better. I don't think special educators ever plan for, hey, this is what I'm going to do for my whole class of teaching reading, right? We're looking at each individual student and thinking, how do I need to tweak for this kid and this kid and this kid? That's why it's special. It's special education. It's not the same thing for everybody.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I know it's based on the student, and it's based on what the goal is, but roughly how many data points should we be collecting on a student in a 9-week period? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 6? Is it 9?
Depends on who you ask, right? And it really depends on what type of data you're collecting. Kind of the old tried and true rule for data points is that you really can't determine a trend in the data points. You can't produce a valid trend line if you don't have at least 4 to 6 data points. Now, if you're using some bigger kind of assessment, it'd be really hard to collect that much. If you're using a collection of indicators, it really is pulling together everything and just making that kind of one judgment per 9 weeks when you put that together. If say you're working with a student to try and decrease some self-injurious behaviors, kids who are, you know, hitting or scratching themselves or things like that, you collect it every day, right? You're going to have so many data points throughout that time period, because you're probably not going to say, I'm only going to look at every Thursday and then look at how things are going. That's something that is so significant that you're probably collecting data on it every time it happens. But I think what we need to make sure that we get away from are just those sticking to I'm just going to wait until the end of the 9 weeks and collect a data point, because it's really not going to inform you of much if you're only collecting that one data point. For example, on like reading fluency, if I only measure that every 9 weeks, then by the time you get to 4 to 6 data points, your year's almost over before you really know what the trend looks like, especially because we know that our students do a lot of this, right? Their data points are not just in this nice, smooth trajectory. Does that make
Right.
sense, Glenda?
It does. And I know the big question that I run up against all the time is that, you know, it says with an 80% accuracy in 3 out of 4 attempts. And I cringe when I read this and you ask this teacher and they say, well, I'm only evaluating, it says 4 attempts. So that's 1 per 9 weeks that I'm looking at. And then somebody else says, no, that's 4 attempts within the 9 weeks. It's
Yeah.
just, it's all over the board. And I just cringe. And I'm like, I don't know what's right and what's wrong.
And I think that is important, because when you keep putting more and more parameters on a goal like that, sometimes it gets really hard to even understand how to interpret that, right? I really prefer, I mean, yes, we need to have either a percentage or a number that we're shooting for or something like that to make it measurable. And we need to know that if I reached that, did I really reach it or not? And so that's where the 3 out of 4 attempts sometimes gets thrown in, but I think that gets confusing. I prefer goals to have things like so many consecutive assessments, right? So that it's clear that if I can do this 3 times in a row, like on 3 different assessments, I'm going to feel pretty confident thinking I know how to do this. I've mastered this at the level that we're looking at. And if I'm up and down and up and down, I'm probably not there yet, right? But I think you're not really looking at, did I meet the goal or not, until you're kind of at the end of the IEP. The progress monitoring intent is to figure out, are we on track to meet the goal at the end of the IEP? So it's not necessarily that you have to have 4 different assessments in order to be able to assess that goal. But, you know, if at the end of the first 9 weeks, we say, you know what, we had 2 different assessments and I was at a 70 and then I was at a 74, we're making some improvements based on where we started, and we're hopeful that by the end of the IEP, we will be able to say on 3 out of 4 of the most recent assessments, we hit that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, let's just talk briefly about formative and summative assessments. And I know we're using all different kinds of data to know more about a student. So when we use that formative assessment cycle, we're assessing all the time, right? So we're assessing throughout the instructional process. We already know things about the student even before we start. But then when we have an assessment, it's identifying some of those gaps between where we want the student to be and where they are right now. And it helps us to then kind of figure out, okay, what are some different approaches that we could take? And then we have to do it, right? So we think, oh, well, I could try A or I could try B, and then I have to make some shifts in what's happening instructionally, and I assess again. And I think, again, whether we're talking about students who have disabilities or students without disabilities, really good teachers already do this. They don't just wait until the end of the unit and give a test. They don't just wait until the end of a 9 weeks and give one test and say, here's your grade, right? They're using daily information. So some of you mentioned even things like exit tickets and classroom assessments. Every time you give that assessment, it tells us something more about, did they get it? Did they not? Did they partially get it? Where are the misunderstandings? And we reteach and we loop back in and we change what we do. So that formative assessment cycle is really important in making those instructional shifts throughout our year with the student, throughout a lesson with the student. And in working on those goals, we know that sometimes we have to maybe assess in some different ways. We're always bound to what we put on the IEP, but then we're not limited to what is on the IEP. And I think that's sometimes where we get hung up too, is we say, you know, this is what we're going to use for progress monitoring, so we got to stick to that. That's just the part that we're collecting for reporting progress on the goals. We're using tons of other information, and we may say, you know, I have a different assessment that's going to be helpful. We don't use that then to go back and report on for the goals, but it's surely going to make us better teachers for how to get to the goals. And we also use the summative assessment process too. And again, that's an important part of seeing the end result and the end outcome. So this is also a constant cycle of we teach, we assess, we try to figure out based on the assessment what's going on. We plan the next round, and then we're teaching again and assessing. It's just more big picture, right? So there's not a lot of difference, quite honestly, when you look at summative versus formative assessments. It's more related to the time period that we're talking about, collecting data throughout something that we're learning, or bigger picture of kind of long-term planning for what we know students tend to need, and teaching that and coming back to it. So some of this information you should be able to get to from your gen ed teachers. You get a lot of your summative assessment information and sometimes some of your formative assessment information from the teachers that are part of the team for that student. But remember, they know what they have to share back with you related to those goals. If you're asking them to collect some of the data, they don't always know to give you some of this information, right? If this is not what they've been told, hey, I need you to collect these data points, or hey, I need you to tell me what your chapter assessment is for the student, then they just may not automatically share all this information back. And this is important for the whole team to really know about. So sharing that information across people is what helps us to be good collaborators and good team members when it comes to the student. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about data-based individualization, and this looks like this big crazy model, and it's really simple. It is. So there is a link to the National Center on Intensive Intervention website on the Padlet, and it takes you right to the page that starts talking about data-based individualization. That is only one tiny fraction of what the NCII website has on it. I just wanted you to specifically have the link to the DBI information. I love this process. Like I said, it is much simpler than the graphic actually looks like, but I've seen this process used for both for students with disabilities as you're trying to figure out what to do, as well as for students who are in like an intervention process and they're kind of moving from tier 2 to tier 3. So when you've got something good, but it's not good enough, how do we ramp it up? And so let's take this back to just talking about students with disabilities. I know every special educator has had a student that didn't meet a goal, right? That had a goal and you tried everything you knew how to do, and you get to the point of looking at the progress at the end of the year and go, oh, we didn't make that goal, right? We didn't achieve what we had hoped. And the question becomes, I did everything I knew how to do. What else could I do, right? So the data-based individualization process is really about guiding you through how to make things even stronger. And by using a lot of really good diagnostic data. And so I just want to give you kind of an example of this. So this talks about in the very first box, the orange rectangle, that you've got to start with something good. And so this talks about like tier 2 protocols, interventions. I'm also talking about the things that you do as a special educator, right? You know some good practices, some good programs that you're using, good ways of teaching. You're already doing that, and you're monitoring the students' process or monitoring the students' progress. Now, when a student is responsive, great, we keep doing those things. But again, we use that formative and summative assessment data to make shifts all along the way. As we collect that data, we make little tweaks. But when a student is not responsive, and you're like, wait a minute, I'm giving you the good stuff, and you're still not making progress, now we have to dig into something else. And it's really important that we look at diagnostic data. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that you've got to have a new evaluation or that you need to go out and have some, in-depth neuropsych testing or medical records, right? Yes, we have all of that good stuff, but when you're talking about simplifying this back to what you can do as a special educator, we look at diagnostic data by digging further into the assessment data that we have. So as an example, you may give, let's say, a long division probe to 10 different kids who all get a score of 5 out of 10, right? Same score. If we were just looking at the score, that tells us that all kids failed, right? That's not good. We don't like that. But it doesn't really tell us anything about what to do, except for we need to go back and teach this again. If we start looking at the error patterns that students make, the different questions that they missed, we start to see that everyone got a 5 out of 10 for a very different reason. So one student may not pay attention to the process, right? They don't know the steps of long division. Another student maybe got a 5 out of 10 because they made calculation errors. They knew the exact steps, but they're missing the actual math calculation piece of it. Another student maybe gets their numbers kind of out of line when they're bringing down things and their columns get all wonky. That's a different reason for missing things. Another student may have difficulty because halfway through the test, I got the first 5 right, and then my attention span, I'm looking out the window, I'm watching the kid next to me, right? That's a totally different reason for missing things. So how we treat that, how we approach it to support the student better in getting towards what we want, which is for them to be successful in that skill, is going to be very different. We're teaching a different thing. We're supporting it in different ways. So we have to take that data and adapt what we're doing by making it stronger. So there are some really good ways, and you can find these all on the DBI portion of that website. There are different ways of intensifying interventions. So some of that has to do with really looking at the kind of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. So making the dosage of something stronger, building in behavior supports. There are just so many different ways that we can tweak the kinds of things that we do. There is a wonderful, I'll actually upload this to the Padlet. I probably won't until tomorrow, but there is a checklist of intervention intensification that is, I think it's a great way to say, how can I take the stuff that I'm already doing and just make it a little more customized for this kid so it's more likely to work based on what I know about them. So it's a really good checklist. The other the other thing that we sometimes have to consider is at what stage is this student in learning that particular skill? Because sometimes that changes how we approach supporting it, whether they're in that acquisition stage, whether they're trying to build fluency. You know, it really has to do with, do I not even know this at all? Or am I just not fluent with it? Or can I not generalize it from one place to another? You know, you sometimes will have a student who can do a skill in your classroom and they go back to the regular class and it's like they've never heard of the concept, right? So again, when we know more about what's going on and why a student doesn't reach a goal, then that tells us more about how do we switch things to be able to support it. I know that's really only kind of scratching the surface of data-based individualization, but they have a really good module on this on the website if you want to dig into this a little bit more and kind of understand it better. But I will make sure to upload that resource. Any questions related to DBI or any of the other things that we've talked about so far?
I guess I'll take one. So one question I have is kind of going back to the one I offered earlier, just kind of integrating and bringing it all together here. When we're using data, right, to intensify interventions and enhance likelihood and probability of success, how are we to communicate, right, using that risk framework, whether or not it's the intervention that is successful compared to other potential control factors like student buy-in, or I guess, how are we able to assert that it is what we are doing that is supporting the child and their learning goals?
Quite honestly, we probably never can be sure of any of that because, you know, we don't ever have a condition where for students in schools, we would have them in a control group or a, you know, an experimental group. It's never going to be a clean kind of thing. So, you know, the best that we can do is talk about the data and use the data to be as transparent as we can with the rest of the team and with the parent to say, hey, I think this is what might be going on, and I'm going to make kind of some switches here. If it's switches that have to be made as far as a change to the IEP, then we either need to have a meeting or we need to do a change without a meeting. But I think most of the time, a lot of what we're doing is pulling together data and trying to make instructional changes that don't affect the minutes, they don't affect the location, they don't affect the accommodations, they affect what we are doing. And what we are doing is typically not written on the IEP because that's just part of, y'all are trained to be good teachers, right? I mean, that's why we have this job. And so we make the tweaks, but I think sometimes we forget to communicate those tweaks and say, hey, I noticed this and I saw this, and so therefore I started doing this and it seems to work. And you may have people that come back in and say, you know what, I don't think that's why it's working. We changed his meds, right? They're going to tell you that. That gives you a little bit more information. Or I'm going to tell you why this is not working because he doesn't like this, right? I just had a meeting recently on a student who actually came to it was a video meeting, but came to the table and said, I don't want this. I don't want this many breaks. I don't want to be pulled out for this. And you know that student buy-in piece is important. And so that could be part of it too. But you're never going to have an answer. You're only going to have a hypothesis and you're going to try things out and then you're going to hope that they work. What are your thoughts on that, Ellen? I know that's not
No, I love that answer. I think it's just, I don't know if anybody else has experienced this in, you know, this small subset of teachers, but I feel like there's an increased amount of like pressure from parents and districts for teacher accountability. And so for my like linear thinking brain, I always am like, well, data will help. And so that was part of the reason why I was like, okay, maybe I can learn more about high leverage practices in order to support, right? This idea of clearly I'm doing something by collecting this data and interpreting this data. But because it's not an experimental setup, because we don't have control situations, like it is a perfect explanation for the question that I delivered. Unfortunately, it doesn't help with the larger problem that I'm experiencing.
Yeah. And the scrutiny that teachers face is ridiculous, right? We all know that. As people in education, we know that you are under the gun to produce results, rationales, all of that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's a matter of trial and error in a lot of what we do. You know, it's that constant tweaking things and trying them long enough to be able to collect some data and feel like, hey, I think this is what is causing the change. But it's never a complete science either. I know it's hard. It's really hard. And I say that not being a classroom teacher in, for school age kids, but even teaching graduate courses, I feel some pressure for making sure that students come out with the knowledge that I'm trying to get them to understand, and it's on me if they don't. And I think that's a huge amount of pressure for teachers that are teaching students that have some really challenging needs. It's a lot. So the shift here in my mind, again, is from collecting data to satisfy a requirement to collecting data that we're doing something with that is meaningful and is making a difference in student outcomes ultimately. And sharing information out about data in a way that is truly helpful and leads to the group being able to be part of that problem solving process. You all should not be figuring it all out. I mean, we really need to fall back on that case conference committee or the instructional support team for the student to make full decisions, as opposed to everybody just turning to you as a special educator and saying, okay, what do we do? Right? That's a hard position to be in. And I think when we have data that can present the picture, the story of the student, it helps everybody around that table, whether it's a formal meeting or not, to be able to help with that decision-making process. All right, so as we get better at this, right, as we get better and deliberate about using that data, we are creating truly specially designed instruction and delivery of that throughout the student's day. So I want to give you some look-fors, some things that you ought to be thinking about if this is happening on a regular basis. And if this is happening well, related to those different high leverage practices, here's what you would see. So for that first high leverage practice, using multiple sources of information, you're going to understand different assessment types. Again, I know some assessments, but I don't know all of them. And that's where the team is going to come together. But I tell you, when I had to start explaining more OT reports and speech language reports for meetings that I was at, but maybe they weren't, I had to get more familiar with those things and I had to understand them better. It'll help us to figure out, or we're going to see people using good information, right? Not just selecting assessments because that's what I always use, but thinking, what is it that's going to give me the best information about the student? Identifying and selecting assessments is going to be better. Making sure that we're looking at some of those key times that we want to pull together the multiple sources of information and not just rely on that single data source or single test score or anything like that. So with this second high leverage practice, you're going to see good data literacy. Part of data literacy comes from, do I have access to the information? If you are out of the loop for a lot of key information about a student, because maybe, you know, this is stuff that's being collected in the gen ed classroom, to me, that's a problem. You've got to have the data in order to be able to make it part of the larger picture. So data access is important. And this is another area where I think, you know, it's really important that special ed teachers have got some access to the students' behavioral data that might be logged in through the system, but maybe you're not on the list to be able to see it, right? So sometimes a classroom teacher and a principal can get access to certain pieces of information, but maybe you're not in the loop, and you need to be, right? You need to have access to everything and a good understanding across those different areas too, to be able to share that out. And then if you're really, every time you pull together another piece of information, it's not that you have to have a chart up in front of you, but if you can use that, review, interpret, streamline, and communicate, and just be thinking about that before something gets sent out or shared out in prepping for those conferences. How can I put this in a way that is going to be easy? Because you know that you have parents that come into an IEP meeting and you pass out that draft IEP and you pass out maybe a copy of the evaluation reports, and you see parents just like, all right, they're overwhelmed by looking at the thickness of the paper, let alone the information that's in there. How can I make this so it's understandable? And I know there's some complications with some of this too, that, you know, you have parents who will get really frustrated sometimes because if you're projecting an IEP or if you're talking about information, it doesn't necessarily always completely correspond with what you're seeing on the paper. And that can be really frustrating too. So just making sure when you're covering the data pieces that you're tying it together. And I want to kind of go back to thinking about that communication piece too. And this is something that I didn't put in here, but a lot of times when we are going over the present levels of performance, we compartmentalize things. And we do that both in the writing of it and in the sharing. So, you know, let me know if you're doing something different, because if you are, that's great. We need to share this out. But a lot of people will be, okay, well, the speech path is going to share her information. And then the gen ed teacher from social studies is going to share something. And then we've got the language arts teacher that shares something. And then I'm going to tell you how they're doing on this piece in my class. And it's like everybody does their piece, but we don't necessarily weave that together for the parent. Now, we know we have to do that in an evaluation report. I mean, that's part of my job if I am pulling together all the parts and pieces of an evaluation, is to do that weaving, that synthesizing, and boiling it down to what does it all mean when I put it all together. That's my responsibility. But it really should be part of the responsibility when we're sharing data at a typical ACR, right? That we are not just saying, they did this, we got this grade, attendance, but what's the big picture look like? Because it definitely shouldn't be the parent's role to try and like put that all together in their head. Hopefully that made sense. Does anybody have a practice that they're using at meetings that you're like, I'm really proud of this and feel like we do it a little different? I was hoping for a magical experience here with with sharing things out, but I think it's just really hard sometimes. Something crazy is happening on my screen here. All right, so with using data to make adjustments, again, if we're using formative assessments and we're using those summative assessments and going through those different cycles to make the tweaks, then we're doing things well. I'm sorry, guys. I have this crazy thing on my screen that I can't get to go away and see anything. Using data-based individualization. If you don't know about data-based individualization, then I would expect that you're not doing that yet. At least not in a formal kind of way. But when you really get good at this and really understand this, it will make a difference in the instructional practices that you have on a daily basis. All right, a couple of resources that might be helpful. Universal Design Daily, it's not comic booky, but boy, is it simple, very simple ways to share information about planning for different ways that we can provide choice for engagement, choice for how a student learns things, and a choice for how they share information. And the reason we added this here as a potential resource is that sometimes we do have the student who is going to fail the test. We know they're going to fail the test before they take the test. But if we try to get the information from them in a different way to really find out what they know, they can give it to us, right? You have a kid who will absolutely fail your test or even sometimes refuse to write. But when you say, tell me what you know about the life cycle of a plant, they can tell you absolutely everything. And that's just a concept within universal design. If you're not familiar with that already, this is a really good start to finding this out. It's a great resource. There's also ASCD puts out a lot of really helpful trifolds that just kind of, again, boil down information. And there's one specifically on using assessments to inform instruction. If there is something that you guys are really interested in, again, email me and I'll see what I can do to be able to connect you with that resource. So, Katie, I want you to come up with 2 random numbers in your head without even thinking, and then look on the list of participants and tell me 2 winners for today.
So just come up with numbers?
Yeah, and then look in your list.
Okay. So how many participants?
There are 9 of us all together, so that's only.
All right, so I'll say 4
7.
and 8. So that would be Ellen Rispoli, I hope I said that right. 6, and Christy Carmichael.
All right, so Ellen and Christy, if you guys will please each email me your mailing address, and I will send you each a set of the laminated guides. You'll love these. I mean, you really will. They are so helpful to have them. I dig into them all the time just to look at the specific kinds of resources they have in there.
I'll double check and see if our school has one already.
But you still have your own.
Yeah, that's true.
It's nice to have them handy in your classroom. So I am going to stay on here for questions, for any questions that you guys might have. But the one thing that I would ask is that you complete an evaluation, and that's the link on the left. You can either complete it through type in the link, or you can scan the QR code, and it's our typical feedback form, just of a few basic questions about the session. We really do collect that information and try to make changes along the way. Again, we're using that formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment, I mean, if you go back through, we had to make some shifts during this, right? Because of the size of the group. We change things how we do it along the way. Summatively, I want to know in the end, you know, where are we at? Are you getting the information? Do you need something different? So I just need that information from you. You will get certificates emailed to you based on just signing in for tonight. Those will probably come, they may come tomorrow, they may not come until early next week, but you'll get the PGP certificate for that. So what kind of questions do you guys have?
Okay, I'll do it again. Um, so one question I have about with data visualization is that for I'm in Indiana, I'd assume most of us are. But that is we use IIEP, and IIEP loves to make just standard line graphs, and that's not right for everything.
Nope.
So would you recommend that we upload visuals and charts into like the document section if we're going over that in a case conference, or how do we document the data that is not specifically embedded into that program?
That is a good question. I think you can. You're not really required to, but you certainly could. I know IIEP is kind of finicky about even importing, like, even when you're writing a report, importing graphs and charts and things like that. And some people will just do those as separate documents. I think what you're talking about, though, in a lot of cases is I have my information that goes into IIEP, and then I have tools that I'm using as part of sharing out that information at a conference, which isn't necessarily something that would have to be included in the system itself. You're probably going to keep those things in the student's file, but you may, I mean, for example, and a lot of people will try and map things out on like a bell curve to explain maybe some standard scores to parents. And you don't necessarily, that information is part of what's already in some other data, but this is just a way to represent it differently. Now, if you're talking about completely different data, again, I would make sure that that data is included somewhere in the present levels or in the progress monitoring piece. But how you represent it to make it easier for people to see doesn't necessarily have to be an additional document. Probably want to go with whatever your district guidelines are. Some districts will want every last stitch of information included and uploaded and documented, and others just want the IEP and progress monitoring notes. I like that question, though. It's sometimes hard to figure out what do we do, but I mean, I've seen such great examples of how people have represented things. And I've also seen the other end. I've seen times when somebody has brought a stack of like daily behavior charts, but didn't bother to put them together to show what does the trend look like, right? We can't all pass around 30 pieces of paper and say, oh yeah, I see how this kid is doing. Put that into a nice little chart and boom, you've got 30 pieces of information that are all in one picture. And I would save that kind of stuff somewhere, but not necessarily into the system. All right, well, I appreciate everyone's attendance tonight. I hope you'll join us on our next session. We'll get into some student wellness information, and then we'll be digging into the instructional pieces, which is intense. There's a lot. There are 2 full guides around instruction, because that's really where it all comes down to, supporting students. So I appreciate you being here, and we will see you next time.